Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, on Iowa Catholic Radio, all the ways that you may be listening to this show and all of the goodies from Iowa Catholic Radio, whether that's the various at this point, radio frequencies that you might be listening live, iowacatholicradio.com live, Iowa Catholic Radio app, if you want to hear us there as well. Then, of course, through the podcast, you can pick up our podcast on iowacatholicradio.com or any good place that Apple distributes The Uncommon Good and all of your favorite Iowa Catholic Radio shows. As I said, this is The Uncommon Good. I'm Bo Bonner, Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing at Mercy College of Health Sciences here in Des Moines. Bud, what do you do here as well?
Excuse me. I am a dean, Dr. Dean. Some people say Dr. Dean, Associate Provost, Attorney at Law.
Nice.
BA, MDiv, PhD. No, Dean, Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the college.
That would be if everyone had to put all of their letters all the time. I realize that my shortened little thing for what I have, like you said, MDiv, is longer than my first name.
Letters can be deceptive, though. Sometimes you need the letters. Sometimes, I don't know. You can you can add a lot of letters through various means, certificates.
You're critiquing like letters in language, like from the top of the hour here, or you just mean when it comes to credentials?
Like with my letters, I'm probably most happy about the MDiv. Yeah, those were the formative years.
Those are the salad days. Have you ever quite figured out exactly what people mean when they're talking about the salad days?
The salad days? Is that the Pittsburgh days?
No, you never heard someone talk about like a younger part of their life and they said, those are my salad days?
Oh, I thought you meant like when I was a Yinzer and they put...
No, they put salad on French fries, or French fries on salad, or one way.
But the younger years are salad days. I'm learning... Last week I learned that some folks call porta potties kaibos.
Yes.
I had no idea.
So did you decide this was a Minnesota thing?
I think it's a scouting thing. I heard it from a Minnesotan who wasn't a Boy Scout, but I was a nerd and did the time and took the research.
That's right.
And some scouts call porta potties kaibos.
And that has to do with a foreign company that made a can that served as some of the first porta potties. Just to get that all out there, I think.
History is fascinating.
Yeah, so you guys need to strap in because this is what today's episode is about. No, it's not.
It is about history somewhat.
It is about history, but not quite something as minute as the history of porta potties. We're done with that history. We should, for at least right now. We'll see if it's relevant with what else we talk about. What always is relevant, you like that right there, is that Mercy College of Health Sciences underwrites our show. Thank you, Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu. We are barreling towards, but we always have this like, oh, it's almost time for the fall semester. It's almost time. And then it's the fall semester, and it's fall, and it's fall, and it's fall. Man, it's almost midterms at this point. But for anybody who's thinking about seeking a career in healthcare, maybe you're in the midterm of your decision. It's never too late to contact mchs.edu and get a look at the many ways that you can extend the healing ministry of the Sisters of Mercy here in Central Iowa.
You're the king of transitions, and I'm always, in my own mind, I'm always curious, like, what's Bo going to use as the segue to talk about Mercy College of Health Sciences? I thought there you were going to say, like, if you want to learn about history, or we do have some offerings. I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, so I gotta kind of keep track of our historical studies.
I gotta say, porta potties probably have done a lot for public health, but yeah, I went for the other one. Okay, last transition. This is not good. It's just we're almost up to the break. We are talking about John Henry Newman today, but we just got done with this very long St. Augustine's radio reading roundup with Newman, especially since we got an expert here right in the studio. We're going to do a radio reading roundup of maybe his works in general, or more of a potpourri about places people can enter into John Henry Newman and reading him. And so when we get back from the break, that's what we'll be talking about. John Henry Newman, Radio Reading Roundup. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It's so wonderful to have you with us. We are doing our John Henry Newman Radio Reading Roundup. Won't be exactly like the Augustine one, precisely because there's so much to talk about. And I'm sorry, if you are best friends with a Newman scholar, the regard, of the reverence, of the revered intelligence of Bud Marr sitting here, you don't just contain yourself to simply one work by John Henry Newman, but I think we decided today we're going to talk about his life, and so we have one work in mind, particularly. We were just talking about how I would slaughter the title, but his Apologia, his sort of account of his life, but I think we can also get into details that are more than just what he says in that book. Well, first of all, let's start out. You have a very personal, story-based connection to John Henry Newman being a saint. So can you briefly talk about how you're luckier than everyone currently listening, and brag just a little bit about God had enough favor on you to get to see the canonization of maybe the most important saint in your at least intellectual, if not your spiritual life?
Well, I'll go back even further than that. Where I first got really interested in the work of Newman was when I was in Protestant seminary. So I was joking about the MDiv on the first segment of the show. And studying at Duke Divinity School, thinking about being a pastor. And Newman, when he became a cardinal, like each cardinal, they take a motto. And his was Cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. And there's a way in which Newman spoke to my heart. Like, of course, we all draw on the Christian past, and some people are, there are Catholics who have a strong devotion to St. Therese and the story of her life and her little way. We've been going through the life of St. Augustine. For me, there were things and ways that John Henry Newman said. I butchered that. Yeah. There were things that John Henry Newman said and ways that he said it that spoke directly to me. And sometimes this could give a wrong impression because Newman is actually a very agile, sort of nuanced thinker. But at moments, he has these like piercing phrases. And so I believe in the essay on the development of Christian doctrine, he's talking about the historical past. And at one point he says, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. Mm-hmm. And he goes on to unpack that phrase, like taken out of its context, it probably sounds like harsher than he intended it. But at that moment when I'm in Protestant seminary and I read that for the first time, I felt like I had to pursue what Newman meant. And to really look into the Christian past and to see it again with fresh eyes. And that began a whole breadth of study into Newman's works, up to the point where you're referring to, where in 2019, at the time, I was the director of the National Institute for Newman Studies in Pittsburgh. And that institute, for short, we would say NINS, they were founded by the Pittsburgh Oratorians. And the Oratorians are kind of like a unique religious community. I say unique because they don't take distinctly the vows that, like, say, Benedictines would. Mm-hmm. It's priests who live in community. They eat together. They pray together. But it has less structure than some religious orders, really to kind of enable, in some ways, the intellectual life. And so NINS was founded by the Pittsburgh Oratorians, who for many years had a particular devotion to Newman. So the oratory communities were started by St. Philip Neri. And then Newman in England in the 19th century, he was carrying on the torch that was passed by Neri and the Oratorians. And so the Pittsburgh Oratorians looked back, especially to Newman, as sort of inspiration for what they were doing. And at the time, they had been praying for years towards his, first off, that he would be declared venerable, blessed, and then for his canonization. 2019, shortly before the COVID pandemic, just a few months beforehand, my wife and I were able to travel with the staff of NINS to Rome and to observe his canonization firsthand, but also very close to the celebration at the altar, because the benefactors of NINS had, they had been instrumental in helping to further his cause.
So beyond the fact of That's really awesome. And everybody I know, I share this with everyone who knew you, that the ability for that to line up for you, the sort of serendipity, the providence involved, it was really, really awesome. And to get to see pictures that you sent over while this happening and like telling us what was going on. We all, of course, benefited because we had like, you hear eyes in the skies or reporters on the ground, and you were there embedded in the Rome process. So I can't convey to people on air how absolutely marvelous it was to have you be living that dream and us getting to hear that. So in some ways, you have magic John Henry Newman, aura, right? Like we can't look too closely at you while thinking about Newman, or it blinds our eyes, is what we're saying.
Well, it's fascinating how Providence works, because when we went through Augustine, there was a way that Augustine talked about his life, and seeing it backwards to where God had brought him, he could see textures and shades of meaning that wouldn't have been evident like in the moment. So in my own life, of course, I mentioned the way that Newman kind of sparked my conversion. But thinking all the way back to my childhood, growing up in North Omaha in Florence, the parish there was St. Philip Neri. And at the time, I didn't think anything of it. I only stepped into St. Philip Neri when we would like visit their thrift store. But looking back at my life now, I can't help but believe that like Neri was interceding for me. That sort of like laid the groundwork to the study of Newman. And then to be called to Pittsburgh, where Pittsburgh, if folks have a chance to visit that city, you really should stop by the Institute, the National Institute for Newman Studies. There's a beautiful chapel there. The pews, actually, interestingly enough, they were able to preserve the pews that were in a church that he founded outside of Oxford before becoming Protestant. But it was, if you ever visit like St. Mary's, I'm blanking on like the little like suburb, or it was a town, now it's a suburb of Oxford. Littlemore, yeah, where he had his religious community. Mm-hmm. It's you can see how he was already thinking like a Catholic. But that chapel has relics of Newman and these pews. It's a wonderful place with a wonderful library.
Well, before I talk about, and again, we're talking about Newman's biography, and his biography played such an important role in who he was as a saint. And so both Bud and I are converts. So I think it's natural. This is what happens a lot when people start talking about Newman. They start thinking about, an apology of their life and how they start to see this work. But before I get to me, all you got to do to dive more into this and to show that I'm not just saying things about Bud, mosey on over to Amazon, and you need to make sure to look up Ryan J. Marr, because Bud Marr won't get you anywhere. 3 books by said Ryan J. Marr in the room with me. One you can't afford, which was the book on his dissertation, To Be Perfect Is to Have Changed Often. It's fantastic, but it's currently $109 on Kindle. You have nothing to do with that because publishers do wacky stuff like that. But I have great news for everyone. Much more cheap is you did a compilation of Newman quotes. It's just called John Henry Newman, and it's compiled by yours truly, not yours truly, Bud Truly. But then you have one that you yourself wrote called Seeking God with St. John Henry Newman. And I think a fantastic way for people to jump into this. I'm always an apologist for primary literature. I'm usually not telling people to go first to secondary sources. But that book particularly, I think, helps especially people who have not run up against Newman otherwise. You have written a great book for people who are seeking with John Henry Newman, I hope, is sort of a theme through the next shows that we're going to do here with the Radio Reading Roundup concerning John Henry Newman.
Yeah, so today our discussion, as you said, is about his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which translated means like a defense of my life. So an apology in the sense like we might talk about apologetics in the faith. The book was inspired. So Newman, we were talking before the show started, he was an occasionalist, meaning he didn't set out sort of like an academic career where I'm going to tackle these topics. He usually wrote when someone sort of ticked him off. So he would get inspired by some sort of debate that was taking place and, hammer out a book. And this plays into the Apologia. There was a novelist, Charles Kingsley, and so he was known for some of the novels he wrote. And he was discussing Newman actually like in a newspaper, and he basically impugned Newman's reputation. So as we've been hinting at, or like we've been talking indirectly, Newman, you could say he was the most prominent convert in England during the 19th century, we're still living in a time where there's like public anti-Catholicism. You know, you think about Guy Fawkes Day, and to be Roman Catholic was to be sort of un-English, and people saw it as kind of not a rejection, not only of the beliefs of the Church of England, but really like the national heritage. Because if you think about Henry VIII declaring himself to be like the head of the church in England and the break from Rome, there was that, you know, centuries-long history and all that was involved there, all that fray that you can think about. And so Newman converts. This is public news because it's a different era. I mean, I was trying to think of an analogy. It might be like if Billy Graham during the 20th century had become Catholic and how people would have thought and wrote about that.
You're a holier person, because what I thought of is when Sergeant Slaughter in the WWF went from being on America's side, and then he I think he teamed up with the Iron Sheik and like became a bad guy. Like that's how I really have dated myself, but I do think WWF sort of like hero turns to heel is how the Kingsleys of the world thought of it. Because if you straight up read what he's saying, it just starts to be. I mean, in the beginning of the Apologia, Newman in some ways is just being like, you're just like a foaming at the mouth rabid dog saying everything and none of it really works out, which reminds me of another apology, Bud. So I've been teaching Socrates' apology just recently. And one of the overlaps is people, when they started accusing Socrates, just started saying whatever came to mind, even though they contradicted themselves. And Newman, in his very Victorian English way, that whole first chapter of the Apologia is saying, hey, you are so angry that what you're saying contradicts itself. And so I really do think for English people, it was like pretty boy, like, you know, I'm trying, you know, in sports, right? It's sort of like when, I know one, Kevin Durant, of course, yes, when he went to the Golden State Warriors, that's how betrayed the English people felt by Newman.
Yeah, so Kingsley, he gets into this, and the way he impugns Newman's reputation, and I should say, one quick aside, folks always had to be careful when they picked a fight with Newman. So you and I, like, we went to a football game with your son this past weekend, and I'm amazed at his memory about some things. Newman had that same sort of trapdoor memory, and so if you're gonna pick a fight, you got to get your details straight with Newman, and you see this in the Apologia. But Kingsley, his basic charge is that Newman didn't truly have a concern for the truth, and the way that Kingsley comes at this. So a little bit of background, like, enemies of the church, or those who have been critical of the church, will sometimes talk about priests being like Jesuitical. So Catholics, like, we've got a long history. We've got a lot of celibates who have been great scholars and thinkers. And so if you dig into the rich treasures of the Catholic intellectual tradition, Catholic thinkers have thought about pretty much everything.
Yes.
And specifically, so this kind of relates to some of the great Jesuit thinkers. They had discussions, like you and I are teaching a bioethics class right now, and when they talked about moral theology, they would ask questions like, if someone's trying to harm one of your family members,
right,
is it okay to lie to them, or can you withhold the truth? And we don't have time to get into that discussion today, but they, you know, like, someone who's going to actively do harm to an innocent person, there's a way you can withhold the truth so that you prevent that evil from taking place.
Yeah, broad mental reservations for the people who already are already mad that we're not keeping score correctly. Yes. That's what, like, Kingsley has in mind. Those debates in England.
Thanks for the summary. Or, you know, like, it also relates somewhat to, like, discussions of in the confessional, like, how to lead a person to a place where they're living the faith to its fullness. But just that phrase, Jesuitical, like, there was, again, a whole bunch of heft and freight that was caught up in that phrase.
Yeah. Wait, one more.
Yep,
this is great. This is great because it's like English people are like, you know, priests running around, not acting like they're priests, wearing different clothes, hiding in places and houses. You're like, yeah, that's because, like, Queen Elizabeth was hunting them down. Yeah. So, like, that's sort of the level of pettiness about this stereotype. It's like, you know, priests, you can't trust them. They're always, like, saying there's someone else and hiding in priest hiding holes. You're like, you made them illegal. Like, so, at any rate.
So, yeah, Kingsley's, he's drawing on that history, and he's kind of coming at it like, if you read his article, he doesn't really, like, come at Newman head on. He sort of, like, makes these suggestive phrases. But what he seems to be implying with Newman is, so Newman had this public conversion. By public, I mean, like, everyone took notice of it. And what Kingsley seems to be implying is that Newman the entire time had this like Romanist plan.
Yeah.
And so he develops this religious community of young men around him. Several of them convert to Roman Catholicism. And Kingsley is sort of saying, like, you never like were truly actively concerned about the Church of England. You had your own project that you were about. And so Newman goes back through his life. And I mean, he starts pretty much from ground zero, like saying, like, here's where I was born, here's where I grew up. And he gets into basically the background of starting this Oxford movement, which was a renewal movement in the Church of England, and gives a defense about what he was about.
And this, like, really hits to home. I know I completely understand why there's a lot of converts, especially if you were a convert when you were like in Protestant seminary, or that you were like involved heavily in the church you were in before you became Catholic. A lot of this rings true because Kingsley's his accusation. I mean, Bud, have you? I think I've been told that to my face that people thought that, and I'm just wondering, have you ever at least had someone imply heavily that you must have never been serious about X, Y, and Z because they knew you during the transition phase, like you the convert, and of course you're already. I mean, that's what happened. Like I went to divinity school at a Protestant seminary. And you start reading the history, and you go, you have to at least, it seems to me, go, well, how do I narrate why I'm here while trying to make sense of why this all seems to be, so important? And so I think that if you would have seen me during the Duke years, a modern day Kingsley would have accused me of the same thing. But I have to admit, like, I really struggled with the idea about, like, should I go ahead and become Catholic? But to outsiders, they're like, you were always planning this.
Yeah, for sure. I've heard variations of this. So from my own background, I'm trying to think how to like frame this. So going to Duke Divinity School, when I made that decision, the people that I was close to as Christians, they looked askance at Duke Divinity School.
Right.
So we were conservative, sort of doctrinally concerned evangelical Protestants. And so Duke Divinity as a United Methodist seminary, to them, it looked very liberal.
Funny enough, real quick at the time, though, people, that was like, Duke was like the second most conservative, and even then, like conservative probably in a different way, Methodist seminary circa, when we were there, 2003. So
yeah,
just to put that in mind.
Duke in many ways was like at the time very creedal, meaning most of the professors were concerned about the historical confessions of the church, like the Nicene Creed, and even saw like the Protestant Reformation not really as a rejection of something, but sort of an affirmation of the way that they understood Catholicity. Again, I'm hitting some of these bunny trails today that I got to stay away from. Right. But even that concerned some of the folks that I grew up with because we were very like biblicist, and so creeds were sort of burdens that had to be thrown off, or maybe like sort of like a systematization of the Bible that, like they thought like the system sort of overwhelmed the biblical witness. But anyways, I go off to Duke Divinity School, and I think when I became Roman Catholic, there were folks who said to me directly, or I'm sure thought in their heart, like, that's what you get for going off to a United Methodist seminary.
Yep.
And folks face variations of this thing. So like silly enough, or like just I haven't talked to Scott Hahn about his own conversion, but I was on Facebook the other day, and in the comment thread of a post, people were talking about Scott Hahn, and someone said like, oh, he was fired from this Presbyterian church or something, and so like his resources were drying up, and then like Catholicism was like a new horizon for him. So I think a lot of Catholics, like, Hahn's not even on that thread to like narrate his own past, but people who are who object to the conversion that took place, a lot of time it does turn ad hominem, and they think there must be like some sort of like nefarious or egotistical reason why someone went that direction.
I know we're hitting the first break, but that makes me think it's especially funny the more you learn about Newman, because if becoming Catholic was a grand plot to sort of like really make it big, it backfired severely for many years for him. I think sometimes we forget that, one of the things that I hope we eventually talk about is the idea of the university. That's sort of born of, frankly, abject failure in certain ways. And so Kingsley being like, you had this big old plan, and you're like, that guy stepped away from like the poshest Oxford gig. That's like, I don't know how you could have worked less and had a more awesome life than Newman staying where he was in Oxford University. But that kind of shows, I think, how hurt some people were by the conversion, and the vitriol really because it was tapping on a nerve. So it's not only that Newman had to defend himself, but he really had to speak to like why this made so many people raw and exposed when they thought of him. So we'll get to that when we get back from the break. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It is wonderful to have you with us in all the myriad ways that you might be with us here on The Uncommon Good, Iowa Catholic Radio. Thank you very much. We are doing our radio reading roundup on John Henry Newman. As we've sort of hinted at the beginning of the show, we're not going to get into, for a little bit, to the to the degree that we did with Augustine, the books of Newman. We will do that with the sermons, but we're going to take some time just talking about Newman in general, primarily, but like I said, because you are an expert. I'm going to declare it, the Newman expert of Des Moines. I challenge anyone to try to dethrone you on that one. Real quick for me, because we were talking about this with how, because he's a convert and because of how he narrates his life in the wider, life of the church and his conversion. For me, what ended up being weird is after I converted, I have to admit, Newman was not one of the people I read that helped me convert into the faith. Once I converted, this Newman guy kept showing up all the time, though. So, for instance, the first two real jobs that I got in Catholic world, I simultaneously, Bud, was working at the Newman Center at Wichita State and teaching at Newman University in Wichita. So it was like all Newman all the time. And you start reading all of this stuff. Then, of course, you get your PhD in that. You start introducing me to all of your friends, including one Dave Delio, very important in my life. Shout out to Dave. I start reading all of this stuff. I write a paper. I give a talk that eventually becomes a paper that I co-write with Kristen Collier about John Henry Newman's idea of a university and what it has to do with medical education, which makes sense here with Mercy College of Health Sciences. For a while, I get to be a part of the Newman idea with Dave Delio, still a big supporter of all that they do. So eventually, Bud, you were interested in Newman and what he sort of helped you work through as a Protestant. Yeah. Newman got interested in me, and I always tell people I'm a resident alien in Newman studies. I love Newman scholars to death. There's a very particular way a lot of Newman scholars do stuff. So I'm always I feel blessed that they let me, a dirty philosopher who's not sort of like a Newman historian, I get a lot of chances to read and talk about how Newman strikes me. And so I think there's something, you talked about your book, Seeking God with John Henry Newman, this idea of seeking out. Yeah. Newman just seems to be interested in either helping people seek out the church or help people seek out a thread within the church. And I've just felt like that is what a role he's played with me. And I think that shows up very early in what we're talking about today, his life and the apologia.
Well, I think Newman could be the patron saint of many different causes. He, of course, like in the United States especially, is seen as particularly connected to universities and the intellectual life. I think maybe another one, Bo, and this is sort of something that I hear in what you were saying, is the patron saint of Protestant pastors who become Catholic.
Yeah.
Because for a lot of folks, like you and I weren't that far down the train tracks, but if someone's like immersed and embedded in this whole way of life, pastor of a congregation, it involves a great deal of like material sacrifice. And so they look back to Newman as that inspiration.
We did give up the potential of a sweet Methodist retirement fund.
Your pension would have been great.
Yes, it would have been pretty sweet. So, but I mean,
and never pay for housing.
Yeah, supposedly. But the point being is, neither you or I have had tasted the sweet nectar of the Methodist funding system. So you're right. Like people who are entrenched as Protestant pastors, probably. I mean, not quite like everyone knew, like you said, that Newman converted in England. He was that big of a deal. When you're part of Oxford, it's basically impossible that the reading public doesn't know that you've swam the Tiber. But I do think in everyone's individual sort of context, when you are a pastor, especially if you've done it for a while and you're a pastor of a congregation and decide to become Catholic, I'm sure they feel like everyone on earth knows for a while.
Well, you're kind of joking about being on the orbit or sort of like this outsider, the dirty philosopher who breaks into Newman studies. But you were making a really trenchant point right before the break. I was like, wow, that's a good one by Bo. To understand the background to the Apologia, you have to understand in part that Newman, when he looked back at his life, so he doesn't write this right after his conversion. It's in the 1860s. When he looks back, he says, my time in the Church of England, my religion was dreary. That's the phrase he uses. He had some criticisms of like sort of the Anglican celebration of the Eucharist. And so he found that sort of dreary, but he said my career or my undertakings were all successful. We talked about his prominence. He says, since becoming Catholic, so again, leading up to this book, he's like, my efforts have been one failure after another. He started these projects. He started to do an English translation of the Bible. He was appointed rector at the University of Ireland. Those sort of fell apart. His book, the Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, it was delayed to Rome, so there was a bishop who sent it to Rome and was like, check this out for its orthodoxy. Those had all been failures, but he said, like, my worship, my religion has been like a source of unending happiness. And man, we should find this quote about the Mass that he gives. He talks about the Mass having like a profundity and a depth that could never be exhausted. So he sets up this contrast, and that's sort of a segue into, so like what was prominent about his time as an Anglican. For about a decade, he flew under the radar. So he studied at Oxford. Funny enough, for how bright he was, his undergraduate studies were not great. Like when he went to his final examination, we don't really have this built into our studies today, but he was under the line. Like he didn't really make it. Like sort of him being allowed to become an Oxford fellow, it was more like some of the dons being familiar with like how bright he was.
Yeah,
like on the side.
Which, funny enough, I mean, you want to talk about like the fact that to talk about Newman is to just have to bridle back not going down bunny trails.
Yeah.
But I can't tell you, I'm going to have to argue it's something like 80% of everyone who went through Oxford that's like really neat or cool didn't do awesome with what we would call the undergraduate final test. It was always the case that like, yeah, but the dons knew, Iris Murdoch personally and like pushed them forward anyway sort of deal. So I don't know if that's like to commend it or not. My point is that like a lot of people who sort of like aced the test and then got into British, upper crust society, we don't read about now, but the sort of goofballs that like sort of barely made it, but then impressed a professor or another and then went on to have like a brilliant like academic or social career. It's almost a recurring theme.
Yeah, and our listeners can probably identify with this. Newman basically psyched himself out. So there was so much pressure on the final, and it was like an oral exam. And so he studied night and day, and he was like struggling to sleep and things like that. When it came to the exam, he just like sort of melted down. But long story short, he becomes a pastor in the Church of England, and it's sort of like nondescript. In his own life, what's happening is he had kind of had this evangelical conversion. So a sort of like emphasis on a kind of like individual, like personal confession of faith. And then this idea of like that Christ died on the cross for our sins and that you're forgiven through like an act of faith. So like it's sort of a partial conceptualization of Christianity, but not the fullness that we see in the Catholic faith. But he said he moved away from evangelicalism when he was a minister because he didn't find that it mapped on to people's actual lives. And that's where Newman starts to develop a real Catholic sensibility. Later on, he says he can't imagine ministering today without the medicine of the confessional. Mm-hmm. But it's really like in his parish life as he's interacting with the members of the congregation that he moves beyond evangelicalism until he gets to the point where he becomes the leader of the Oxford movement. They were sometimes called Tractarians because they spread their ideas through writing these tracts, like small pamphlets where they would make arguments.
Cutting edge media theorists is like, but that's to go off a completely different trail. But
if you see Bo and I in downtown Des Moines handing out pamphlets, we're just starting like a second Oxford movement.
That's right.
Des Moines movement. But so Newman's leading this Oxford movement. The way that you can encapsulate this, Bo, is he called it like a second Reformation. So he was critical of the original Reformation. And what Newman tries to do, we don't have to get too deep into this, but what he tries to do is he says, like, if you look at the Caroline Divines, so this is a group of scholar priests like in the Church of England, and then if you look at the actual articles of the Church of England, he says there's a way where you can understand them in a Catholic manner. And so what Newman's trying to do in the 1830s is he's trying to re-Catholicize the Church of England. Anglicanism, or in America it's called Episcopalianism, it's kind of a weird animal in this sense. There are some Anglicans or Episcopalians where if you went to their service, it would resemble or approximate to a mass. Like you would be there and be like, oh, I recognize this, that, and the other. There are also Anglicans who, they look at Roman Catholicism and they say like, no, that was the wrong path. And what they're about is more of what's called like low church worship. Mm-hmm. And so it resemble more of what you'd see at like Church of Hope in West Des Moines.
It's really hard for people to get this point because if you think of Newman, or I mean, there's just a lot of cultural cachet. If you're into Christianity at all, you'll get this idea like, oh, Anglicans especially, but Episcopalians are like Catholics light. Definitively not the case, and certainly up for grabs in the 1830s. Yeah. You are beyond like the Reformation, but I mean, you have a whole period with like the Roundheads and things like this, and like Cromwell Part 2, both Cromwells, terrible people. But Oliver is who I'm getting onto at this time. I mean, they make, what do they call it? Institutional. I'm trying to think of like the right word they use, but it's like the people who have the stamp and they're doing it the right way. Mm. It's incredibly low church. I think even would be surprising to modern day Episcopalians. Yeah. And so 1830 making the argument that it's really just sort of, like you said, he's calling it a second Reformation. It is a recovery or restorationist movement he's leading. There are people who tried to always do this, but it really is the Oxford Tractarians that I think are solely, that's not true, very responsible for any of the sort of Anglo-Catholic world you might run into, even in Episcopalianism today in America.
So the real rupture or the line in the sand for Newman is, I talked about them being Tractarians and publishing these pamphlets. Newman writes this Tract 90, and he goes back to a Catholic council, the Council of Trent, which took place after the Protestant Reformation. And he makes the argument that like there's a way in which Anglicans can sign on to the Council of Trent. What's problematic, he says, about Tridentine Catholicism is these sort of like interpretations after the fact. He's also working with the 39 Articles of the Church of England, which is their foundational confession of faith. And he tries to interpret those in a Catholic manner. So he goes to these things and he's like, the 39 Articles aren't rejecting purgatory in say like the essence of the doctrine, but there are like Catholic devotions that have built up around purgatory that are problematic. Or he reads like how it talks about sola scriptura, or like looking to the Bible as the final word. And he's reading these. He's saying like we can in theory sign on to the Articles of Anglicanism and be fully Catholic. At the same time, he's like praying the Roman Breviary. Mm. He's starting what's basically a religious community. And so they're being drawn to historic Christianity. Like as Catholics, we recognize all of these things like religious community, the breviary, during the celebration of the liturgy, like wearing certain sort of vestments, having like candlesticks on the altar and things like that. And the Church of England, they're having arguments about whether that's proper and allowed at all. Looking back, it can be confusing to us because, like I said, there is a strand of Anglicanism that's called Anglo-Catholicism, and they try to be as Catholic as possible without signing on to the idea of the papacy. That really goes back in a lot of ways to Newman. Like he sparked that trend in Anglicanism.
And again, not to give too much context, but so the word I was looking for before, Bud, was conformist. And so like the conformist, right, are those who like sign on whatever the official doctrine of the state Church of England is at the time, which has been a moving target even before Newman's time. What's weird, right, is nonconformists, which is a broad category that goes from everything from like the Puritan Pilgrims to Anglo-Catholicism. And so it's weird to think that Anglicanism is sort of like this atom that's always shooting off nonconformist electrons. And to be rude, they're in some ways mostly more interesting than the actual molecule, because this same sort of energy, to use that word in a pun sort of way, John Wesley comes from this, like a century before, a few decades before.
Let's see. Newman is born 1801.
Yeah.
You're probably more familiar with Wesleyan history. Like Wesley is more 18th century. I mean,
so at the very end of it, right? So like that. But the point that I'm getting at is, you weirdly have in England people who are not quite satisfied with the Reformation argument being made in England. And so famously, John and Charles Wesley, who are brothers, like Charles Wesley writes a lot of the hymns that frankly Catholics now sing in English. But it's weird that like you have a lot of people who have sort of evangelical awakenings and they're named John. So John Henry, John Wesley both have these like heart strangely warm moments. But then they like really start to ask questions about like, but what does the church have to look like in lieu of that? And both of them become sort of historians of their own remark. John Henry Newman, a vastly superior historian to John Wesley. John Wesley sort of just famously makes up like, oh, you can just make yourself a bishop if you need to. It's happened in history. Probably not, Mr. Wesley. The reason I bring that up, though, is to say there are a lot of people, I think, Bud, who mistake Newman as just like a nerd who read his way into a conversion. And actually, I think there's a legit argument to say the politics of England as a nation as it stands to the church and this conformist, nonconformist stuff, even if he doesn't write that way, but I think that it's bubbling under the surface, and why you get someone like Kingsley being so personally attacked by seemingly a book nerd who read his way out of the church. That's not how the people at the time interpreted what Newman did.
Well, this is a great point to end on, and maybe we can land the helicopter there. For Newman, the greatest insult that you could probably give him is that something's unreal. And he makes this point. He says like life is for action, and you can't leave your life like in thought. So there's a way, like, he is an intellectual and he sees the temptations there where like you can sort of withhold or like live this life of constant reservation because you can't close every logical or intellectual concern. If life is for action, if there has to be sort of like a realness to what we're about, even the institutions that we're about, Newman says, like, when I'm at the end of my days in the Church of England, this entire thought that I had created was, he called it a paper religion. So to understand this, Newman thought Protestantism qua Protestantism was wrong. And he wrote criticisms of Luther, what the Protestant reformers first did when he was in the Church of England. He says Roman Catholicism, it's not wrong in what it affirms, but it goes too far. So that like it adds to the foundational confessions of the faith. And
Newman, as an Anglican, is saying this just to repeat for people to realize.
So when he's an Anglican, like in the 1830s, he narrates his own project as a via media or middle way between the wrongness of Protestantism. Protestantism, in his view, has rejected the truth, and the corruptions or accretions that he sees in Roman Catholicism. So he has what's called a branch theory of the church. And he says, like, there's the Roman Catholic branch, there's the Eastern Orthodox branch, and then there's the Church of England, and these are branches in different parts of the world. As Newman begins to, like, as he gets deeper into history, he says the middle way is a paper religion. It's something that he's invented. And the way he thinks about this is he looks back to previous controversies. He says with the controversies, the orthodox answer or the right answer was not always the middle way between two extremes.
Right.
So it's not like there was like the Arians and then on the other side, the semi-Arians or whatever. And then like orthodoxy was like it cut the middle path.
Right. He
said orthodoxy is just affirmed by the global church. There's a phrase from Augustine that a Catholic bishop quotes. It's in Latin, it's securus judicat orbis terrarum. And it's rough to translate, but it basically means the world stands secure in its judgment. And so as Newman's like, as he's looking back at these previous arguments, he says at one point in the Apologia, I looked in the mirror and I realized I was a monophysite. Now, he's not saying like, I totally bought like this heresy that Jesus had like just one nature or whatever. But he realizes like how he's conducting himself is sort of like, it's this intellectual project, but the church, when it decides these things, it's the church Catholic and it's binding on the entire church. Also, when you talk about, I can't pass over one point. So in Jerusalem, the Church of England had like a diocese there. And so again, Newman says like Anglicanism is the middle way and it's a branch of the one Catholic Church. They have this diocese in Jerusalem and they strike up a deal with Lutherans where the bishopric will pass from an Anglican to a Lutheran. So there will be an Anglican bishop and then there will be a Lutheran bishop. And because Newman's concerned about not religion on paper, but how it's actually lived in practice, to him, this is a direct contradiction to the Church of England's claim to be a part of the Church Catholic, because it's basically signing on to Lutheran errors by rotating this bishopric between the two different bodies.
Which, by the way, having gone to Protestant seminary, total Protestant move. We'll leave
nice gesture.
Yeah. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, I have such a great feeling with us starting the new radio reading roundup, talking about St. John Henry Newman. We're talking about his life. We're going to, I think we're in a good jumping off point, Bud, where next week we can talk about how his life leads to the major works that he has read. This idea that he believes a life of action, right, is important. I think is an important way to get away from Newman, who is bookish, retreating, library mouse, who just sort of like writes things because he finds them interesting. He's an occasional writer, which I think people forget sometimes, precisely because he has this sort of pastoral sense of responding to challenges, but doing so with the intellectual rigor that I think can make people misread why we have the corpus of his works that we do.
Yeah, so today we sometimes have theologians who, as they write, they're basically trying to build their CV or their kind of resume. Newman was not about that. He was not an ivory tower theologian, as we talk about those things today. He really saw like his ministry or pastoral practice as caught up or interwoven with what he was writing and concerned about. If you want to undergird your own life in prayer, please join us on the radio. So we pray the rosary on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., 2:55 in the afternoon, we broadcast the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. You can always use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere.
If you go to iowacatholicradio.com, it's easy to stay up with events happening in and around both the Diocese of Des Moines, of course, here in Des Moines, but everywhere that our radio signal transmits. So please keep up to date. I know that they're making special efforts to try to get us doing events out and about in the whole listening area. But once more, whether you're listening live, on air, on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or podcast, we want to say thank you for listening to the show. On October 13th at West Des Moines at noon, St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church, Man Up West Power Lunch with Reverend Father Ignatius Makoji, a Catholic priest of the Missionaries of Divine Mercy Religious Order. So go listen to him. October 19th in Winterset at St. Joseph Catholic Church, 6:30 p.m. Joe Heschmeyer from Catholic Answers. So go listen to him, that apologist. And then, of course, November 11th, we have another West Des Moines event, Spiritual Warfare for Women of Grace, Jonette Williams. And then, of course, December 8th at 6 p.m. at the Embassy Suites downtown, dinner in December with Dr. David Anders. Make sure to go online to iowacatholicradio.com to learn all that is about. Bud, we wrapped up the fall fundraiser last week. Well, we're on a weekend, but you know what I mean, 2 weeks ago. We want to thank everyone who donated, but even now, it's still not too late to donate. This ministry is not possible except by your involvement in it, both volunteer, of course, and your prayers lift us up on the sea of change, but also your donation. So iowacatholicradio.com to donate, or 515-223-1150 to call, leave a message, or text to talk about donating. We appreciate all that you do. Bud, I'm very excited about looking forward to seeking the truth and God with John Henry Newman in the upcoming episodes.
Yeah, I think it's officially Pumpkin Spice Season 2. So if you donate to the radio station, you earmark it in honor of the uncommon good, I'll host you for a pumpkin spice latte.
Wow.
It's not a John Leonetti outing, but the next best thing, maybe.
I thought you were going to make a connection between the canonization of pumpkin spice, but that's probably too much to expect of Italy. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, families, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.